welcome everyone. This is the 4th annual Weissberg Lecture on International Human Rights. As many of you know, I'm Beth Doherty and I'm the chair of the Weissberg program. And it will be my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Mark Drumbl. But first, let me recognize the individuals who are really responsible for this evening, and that would be Marvin Weissberg, who is a proud Beloit parent, and his daughter Nina from the class of 1984. Their generous support for international engagement at Beloit College has allowed us to do numerous things over the past 10 years. In addition to today's forum on international human rights, we also will welcome the college's 13th Weissberg Chair this spring. His name is Yuri Jabladze. He will be here in late March, and his residency will focus on Russia's political transition since the collapse of communism. Since 2008, the Weissberg Fund has provided grants for 28 students to carry out international projects related to human rights over summer and winter breaks. The next deadline, students, is October 24th, and you can apply by visiting the beloit.edu/Weissberg site. And we encourage you to do that. This year, the Weissberg program is very proud to announce 3 new initiatives. First, the Weissberg Scholarship will help support students who have a demonstrated interest in and commitment to understanding and advancing human rights. Secondly, we have a job shadowing program that will fund students to visit human rights-related organizations for a week during spring break. And thirdly, the Weissberg Fellows Program, which will provide bridge funding for recent graduates to enable them to pursue the next step towards further study and careers related to human rights. And again, information on how to apply for these opportunities will be available on the Beloit website on the Weissberg area. So just thank you again to both Marvin and Nina for their many marvelous contributions to internationalizing the Beloit campus. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Mark Drumbl. He is the director of the Transitional Law Institute at Washington and Lee University School of Law. He has his bachelor's degree from McGill University, an MA halfway between McGill and the University of Paris. His LLB is from the University of Toronto, and he has an MA and a doctorate in law from Columbia University. And as you may have guessed from some of those affiliations, Mark is actually Canadian. He is the author of 2 books. The first, Atrocity, Punishment, and International Law, won several awards for its re-examination of how individuals who perpetrate genocide and crimes against humanity should be punished. His work has been relied upon by the Supreme Courts of Canada, by the United Kingdom High Court, and the Supreme Court of New York in several recent decisions. And he has had visiting appointments at a number of universities across the globe, including Oxford, the University of Paris, the University of Ottawa, Trinity College in Dublin, and the University of Melbourne. This evening, he's going to talk about the topic of his second book, which is forthcoming from Oxford University Press early next year, entitled Reimagining Child Soldiers in International Law and Policy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Drumbl to Beloit College.
Well, thank you, Beth. It is such a delight for me to be here. I got in late last night, and so this is exciting for me. It's my first trip to Wisconsin. It's my first time at Beloit, and I have to say, so far at least, I have been incredibly enthused by the level of vigor, enthusiasm. I just loved that panel earlier today. I found it incredibly inspiring to see this level of commitment to human rights, both internationally as well as in the United States itself. I've really enjoyed my time with students today in a variety of classes. I've spoken so much today that I'm not even fully aware whether I'm just going to repeat myself or not, but I won't, and I'll make a serious effort not to. So Beth, thank you very much for the invitation. Scott, I'd also like to thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and Josh for all of the organization that went into making this visit so enjoyable. So, my talk tonight is entitled Reimagining Child Soldiers in International Law and Policy. And I first became interested in the intersection of youth, militarization, and violence when I worked as a defense lawyer in the Rwandan jails in the aftermath of the 1994 genocide. And among my clients were a number of youth. And it was interesting to me to contrast their situation, and these are individuals who are accused of terrible crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity. And it was interesting for me to contrast their situation and what they were like with my adult clients, many of whom were just 20 or 21, so young adults, but over that magical hump. And of course, also to contrast them with some of the women clients that I had, both adults and children. And I left Rwanda with a sense, on the one hand, that criminal trials serve a fairly limited role in effecting justice, reconciliation, and rehabilitation after terrible incidents of mass violence. And that has informed a lot of my subsequent thinking on the subject, and the previous book that I wrote really took a skeptical view of the role of the criminal law and was much more attracted to restorative forms of justice, particularly for lower-level offenders. I also left Rwanda with a sense that the lines between adult and youth, between adolescent and youth, were not as bright and not as firm and not as apparent to me as I had thought that they would be. So leaving with those two impressions, I thought about them a lot. I talked about one in one project, and now I'm talking about the other in another project, this one. Worldwide, tens of thousands of children currently serve as soldiers. The number of former child soldiers is considerably higher, and also roughly numbers in the tens of thousands. The past 10, 15 years have seen a variety of conflicts in which children had been deeply implicated. Liberia, Sierra Leone, for example, northern Uganda, have seen many children recently demobilized, and they face considerable challenges adjusting back to civilian life and returning to their communities of origin. Finally, there is very little to no data on the numbers of children that soldier and don't survive conflict. It has been estimated that at any given time, the overall number of actual and former child soldiers is roughly in the 250,000 to 300,000 range. There are also many children serving in military forces in countries not at war, or serving in military forces of countries who are at war, but who don't go to the front lines. And this is one such country. In the United States, military recruitment is effective as of the age of 17. So too is it in the UK and Canada at 16, in France, Italy, the Netherlands, Germany. The global face of child soldiering is not just an African one. Roughly 40% of child soldiers in the world are on the African continent, but that is a plurality, not necessarily a majority. When child soldiers are decommissioned and demobilized and returned to their home communities, they face considerable challenges, adjusting to and reintegrating into civilian life, particularly reintegrating durably. And by that I mean becoming anchored into sustainable employment and being viewed as integrated citizens, capable of demanding rights of others and assuming their own responsibilities. My goal in undertaking this project is to offer a critical thought, to ask hard questions about how international law and policy conceptualizes the child soldier and how international law and policy can improve the reintegrative, rehabilitative, restorative needs of children associated formerly or currently with armed forces, and also to try to think more effectively of deterring child soldiering and preventing it. Let me start off with a definition. Before we get to the definition, let's also recognize that one of the best ways to deter child soldiering is in many ways to embolden the rights of the child. But I think when we think of emboldening the rights of the child, it means emboldening both rights, but also transcending stereotypical views of youth and adolescence. So, what is a child soldier? Under prevailing and emergent international law and policy definitions, a child soldier is any person below the age of 18 who is or has been recruited or used by armed forces or armed groups in any way. So, the chronological yardstick is at the age of 18. Armed forces are the official state forces of nations, okay? Militaries. Armed groups are rebel groups that fight state authority, dissident movements, and in certain jurisdictions, political criminal syndicates, like in Colombia, the FARC, that may engage in conflict against the state. The definition of child soldiers moves well beyond soldiering. It covers children who porter, serve as spies, sentries, domestic help, and sex slaves for armed forces, along with combatants on the front line. With that definition in mind, I think it's helpful to take a step back and to think how we currently imagine the child soldier. So what I'm going to do in my remarks now is start off by thinking about imagery. Then I'd like to talk about how that imagery may juxtapose with social realities of child soldiering, the actual facts, the data, as we know them. And then finally, what I'd like to do is talk about how law has grown in a direction that matches the image, but not necessarily the data. And then I want to talk finally and fourthly about externalities, disconnects, shortcomings, and problems that emerge because law and policy follow an image as opposed to the data. One of the panelists earlier today, everyone spoke so impressively, I don't remember who said what. One of the panelists earlier today said that sometimes it's good to get out of your comfort zone. You don't have to leave Beloit to get out of your comfort zone, because I think probably some of the discussion we're going to have tonight might very well push some of you a little bit out of your comfort zone. But I think it's going to push you into a place to be a better rights advocate and a more effective proponent of the best interests of children and of societies that repatriate children who have had the tragic misfortune of becoming enmeshed in fighting forces. Popular discourse conceives of the child soldier through 4 images. The first image that floats out there is what I would call the demon and bandit image. This is the Lord of the Flies vision. This is the Clockwork Orange vision of youth as illogically committed to senseless violence, incorrigible and devilish. And
to some degree, some journalistic accounts of child soldiers portray child soldiers, particularly child soldiers who commit terrible acts of atrocity, in a way that reflects this particular image. And let's be very clear, a small percentage of child soldiers do commit terrible acts: mutilation, amputation, grievous sexual torture, murder, pillage, theft, destruction. And one image that floats out there of child soldiers generalizes that extreme. A second image that floats out there is the child soldier as a hero, the Joan of Arc vision of the child soldier, the child who fights for just cause, is committed to patriotism, vanguard of a new generation, the youth of the Intifada, South African township youth, the Children's March, not in the context of military violence, but the imagery is similar. The 1963 Children's March in Birmingham. If you go to Kelly Ingram Park in Birmingham, there's a statue that commemorates 2 children who participated in the Children's March, a boy, a slightly younger girl. It's an image of children, and in the case of the civil rights movement, happily, civil disobedience. But in the case of other places, civil disobedience can blur into armed violence, and that certainly is the case. The hero image posits considerable agency on the part of the child soldier, but may also venerate military life and violence and often tropes of masculinity. And as a result, it's an image that's more a historical artifact than a current reality. Third image that is out there is the image of the child soldier as part of a lost generation. Permanently damaged goods, wounded by trauma, disabled, mentally, spiritually, and physically, and to be pitied. This model highlights the pain of militarized life, but may also be quietly demeaning and inhibiting. The fourth image is fourth only in the way I describe it. It's by far first in terms of its operational influence and its political currency. And that is the image of the child soldier as a faultless, passive victim. This image presents the child soldier as having no involvement, volition, or will in how he or she ended up in fighting forces, and no input, agency, will, discretion, or say in what he or she does for fighting forces during armed conflict. In human rights literature, and influential human rights activists have described the faultless passive victim and the child soldier in accordance with this model in very dehumanizing vocabulary, as tools of war, instruments of conflict. Minnows, Romeo Dallaire's recent book that came out on child soldiers, minnows in a pond, easy to catch, programmed automatons, weapons of choice. It's very dehumanized language. It captures the power inequities that youth face in military hierarchies, but it does it in a way that dehumanizes the person and treats all child soldiers equally. The faultless passive victim image is also accompanied with a depiction of the child soldier as very young, generally a prepubescent boy, wearing ill-fitting clothes, barely able to carry an AK-47, hunched, bewildered, and overwhelmed. I wrote a lot of my book when I was on sabbatical leave in Australia. And every day when I went to the law school at Melbourne, where I had my office, I walked past the Australian Red Cross. And right on the outside of the Australian Red Cross building at the time was a mural that proclaimed the Red Cross's commitment to ending child soldiering, and it had precisely that kind of a picture on the wall. This imagery of the very young child contradicts the demographic realities of child soldiering, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. The vast majority of child soldiers worldwide are in the 15, 16, and 17-year-old bracket. The image of the boy negates the reality that 40% of child soldiers are girls. The demon and bandit image also negates the reality of 40% of child soldiers being girls, because it presumes the child soldier is a wild boy. Although a lot of research on child soldiering identifies these images, no one yet, I think, has made as forthright a case as I hope to do that because of the influence of global civil society, non-governmental organizations, powerful states, and so forth, that the image of the faultless passive victim has achieved widespread currency, represents the dominant language and vocabulary, and I would venture to say probably informs the way many of you conceptualize who is a child soldier. Undoubtedly, that image represents the lives of many child soldiers. But where you stand often depends on where you sit. And the second part of my book tackles what is fundamentally an epistemological question, a question of language and discipline and source of information. From whom and from where does the international community, what I call the international legal imagination, namely international lawyers, communities of conscience, caregivers, human rights activists, from where do they know what they know about child soldiering? What's the official currency, the official language, and the official disciplines? Two disciplines have exerted considerable influence in informing how the international legal imagination thinks about child soldiering, and consequently, why the faultless passive victim image has such currency. The first discipline is child psychology. Child psychologists have played a determinative role in emphasizing differences between adults and youth, and in elucidating a narrative of war as imposing psychological trauma, and hence the necessity of mental health interventions in order to transcend war, particularly for youth, and at the same time, the fragility and susceptibility of youth such that there cannot be a more nuanced conversation of youth caught up in conflict other than that they are passive, faultless, innocent victims of others. One of the major problems with child psychology and its applicability to child soldiering is that the vast majority of child soldiers are adolescents. Adolescent development neurobiology, adolescent development neuroscience are disciplines that clearly locate spectral differences between adults and youth, but differences that are much less categoric than the differences elucidated between child psychology and adults. The second major source of information on why we think the way we think about child soldiers comes from human rights reports, humanitarian investigations, NGO groups, activists on the ground. And they obtain a lot of their data, and it's a treasure trove of data. The vast majority of their data is obtained through survey questionnaires, short interviews with individuals who then are often recipients of international aid and recognize the internationalists as providers of aid. One of the major problems, as a matter of evidence, as a matter of scientific assessment, is that owing to the short, quick, rapid nature of the interviews and data obtained by NGOs, the content of the information is often distorted. And there's often a tendency for interviewees to tell the interviewers what the interviewers want to hear. And this applies for both adults and youth, for almost everyone in these particular contexts. Moreover, what also happens is, if you read many of these reports, they engage in a writing style that tends to downplay contradictory facts and upplay conformist facts. Activists, in particular lawyers, are often not so good at separating investigation from advocacy, data gathering from policy outputs. And if you read many of these reports, it will become quite apparent to you that they are often motivated by absolutely well-meaning outcomes, as opposed to necessarily dispassionate treatment of the facts. The influence of child psychology and human rights reporting on the available information of child psychology doesn't mean that there are not other disciplines out there that have a lot to say about the subject, and there are such other disciplines. And a big part of my research has involved reviewing and trying to make an honest assessment of what these other disciplines have to say on the subject. One discipline that I found particularly informative is anthropology and ethnographic participant observation. Reporting from people who spend years often within communities and don't obtain information by asking questions, but by listening, hanging out, so to speak. I also look a lot at adolescent development neuroscience, as I mentioned before. I've been very inspired by feminist theory in debating and considering how to articulate the agency of the oppressed and how to affect social change through methods that empower but don't encase vulnerability. I've also looked at some aspects of quantitative research conducted by academic organizations through local intermediaries, as opposed to research conducted explicitly by NGOs. So what does all this research have to say? In a nutshell, it offers a much more dynamic, vivified, and complex portrait of child soldiering, children in armed conflict, and children as they exit from armed conflict. It offers a moving picture of the child soldier as a social navigator, as someone making the best out of a bad situation, doing what they can to wend their way through circumstances that are beyond their control. And these disciplines paint a picture, a composite of the child soldier that looks like none of the four images that I've described to you before as these essentialized depictions, including that of the faultless passive victim. And some of the specific information we get out of these neglected disciplines, disciplines that international lawyers and human rights activists are holding at arm's length, some of the specific data and information we get from them are as follows. As I said before, and you may be surprised, but the vast majority of child soldiers worldwide are not young children. They're adolescents in the 15 to 17 age bracket. Yes, there are very young children who are abducted and who are forced to fight, certainly. But they are the exception, not the norm. They're the outliers, thankfully, not the mean or median. And law and policy does poorly when it generalizes from the extremes, when it normalizes the fringe and bases policy and law on extrapolations from the extremes, because the phenomenon of child soldiering is really the phenomenon of adolescent soldiering. But yet the language of child psychology and the assumptions of very young children dominate, thereby underserving the very constituency that needs the most guidance and the most help. Secondly, you may be surprised to learn, but a significant majority, at least 2/3 of child soldiers, exercise initiative in presenting themselves for military service. A minority, a fairly modest minority, of child soldiers are abducted, forcibly recruited, or kidnapped and compelled into service. Because of the focus on faultless passive victimhood, once again, the abductee has become naturalized or normalized as the average child soldier. And international law and policy has responded to that construct. But that construct is not typical. Because of the focus on abduction, youth volunteerism into fighting forces is radically under-theorized, is radically under-conceptualized. And I argue there is no way to deter child soldiering if much of child soldiering comes from volunteerism, if all the focus on remedial efforts is predicated on the child who is abducted. The response to that, of course, is there's no difference between abduction and youth volunteerism. A 15-year-old in a conflict zone can't really exercise any agency. Most child soldiers are poor, they grow up in endemic violence, families are dislocated. You can't stand here and legitimately, with a serious face, talk to us about youth volunteering in that context. But I would argue that that is a very simplified version of options that are available, because even in the most scarred of conflict regions, even in the most scarred of local communities, no more than 5 or 8% of children end up in fighting forces. The vast majority of children suffer conflict as civilians. Moreover, the reality is that there are certain child soldiers who join and who experience changes over time, diachronically, longitudinally. Some child soldiers become generals when they're 16 or 17. Some child soldiers become leaders of units. Some child soldiers, small percentage, serially commit massive human rights abuses in order to advance in the ranks, to obtain profit, lucre, resources. This is a very small group. You'll also be surprised to know, I suspect, that only a small minority. In northern Uganda, it's been estimated approximately 20% of children in the Lord's Resistance Army, one of the most appalling rebel fighting forces on the planet. No more than 20% are implicated in the commission of acts of atrocity or crimes against humanity. The vast majority of child soldiers serve as porters, sentries, spies, as I said before, sex slaves. Very few are implicated in acts of atrocity. The focus on faultless passive victimhood also obscures another critically important piece of data. In northern Uganda, you'd probably be surprised to know, the vast majority of child soldiers, they don't exit armed forces because they're rescued by international humanitarians. They don't exit armed forces because they're captured by the other side or the better side and are released. The vast majority of child soldiers exit armed forces because they willingly leave or they escape. And in-depth interviews with former child soldiers conducted through participant observation reveal a variety of motivations for why child soldiers leave. Some leave because they tire of the war and they realize their side won't win. Others leave because of interpersonal conflict with other members of fighting forces. Moreover, the ethnographic research indicates that there is a large group of child soldiers who exhibit tremendous levels of resistance, opposition. They refuse to commit violent acts against innocent civilians. They exercise their discretion to avoid, ignore, minimize hurtful orders. And then there are some, going back to what I said before, who exercise their discretion to exceed orders, and they often operate quite independently. The final interesting point that comes out of much of this data underscores the tremendous abuse, physical, mental, and spiritual, that is inflicted upon child soldiers in periods of conflict. But yet, you'd also be surprised to know, I suspect, that thankfully, following conflict, many child soldiers are remarkably resilient in spirit. And much detailed survey coming out of many jurisdictions underscores that many child soldiers suffer equal or even less levels of psychological pain and trauma than ordinary children in the community who also are afflicted by war. And many adult soldiers suffer equal levels of psychological harm. At the end of the day, the mental health of former child soldiers may be underestimated. I'm sorry, the mental frailties may be overestimated, whereas what is underestimated are some of the social, educational, and occupational challenges that former child soldiers face in reintegrating into society. Their harms may be more redressable, not through westernized therapy and Freudian approaches, but on the other hand, through much more ontological approaches that underscore job training, better education, and reintegration within the community as a whole. And as a result, excessive focus on psychotherapy, as opposed to these other remedial policies, may actually not serve the best interests of former child soldiers. In the book, I argue that the available information on child soldiers, if it was dispassionately considered as a broad package with a variety of disciplines weighing in, would more accurately present an alternative to victimhood discourse, and the child soldier in that capacity would be better described, as I argue, as a circumscribed actor, as opposed to a faultless passive victim. The most extreme cases can't be generalized, but yet this is what international law does. Now I'll move into the third part of my remarks. It creates what I would describe as a legal fiction. It builds law and policy on cases that exist but are improperly generalized. It doesn't do so out of a sense of malevolence or inaptitude. What it does is it does so out of a sense of the marketing success of faultless passive victim imagery mobilizes public attention, it builds resources, and it can be effective on the ground. But that reality on the ground means, for example, that in many post-conflict societies, international activists come, participate in the demobilization of former child soldiers, and then instruct local communities, the communities from which the children came, where they were dragged into conflict, and against whose members some of them perpetrated terrible human rights abuses. The international community comes in and tutors, and schools, local populations in the notion that whatever the child soldiers did, it wasn't their fault. And that's a very common refrain. Sensitization meetings are set up in local communities so that child soldiers may return and be received. Child soldiers are deemed non-responsible for their actions and their conduct. This is very well intentioned, but survey data reveals that the one subgroup of child soldiers that consistently experience the greatest difficulty upon reintegration are the small subset of child soldiers known by communities to have participated in systematic acts of violence or to be affiliated with groups who have done so. The communities just don't believe the international rhetoric. And in the last part of my comments, I'll talk about what I would propose as a reform. Another focus of international law that builds on the fiction is that international criminal law determines that the way to combat child soldiering is through the prosecution and punishment of individual adult militia leaders who conscript, enlist, or recruit children into armed forces or fighting forces. And the first trial at the International Criminal Court that's going forward involves someone called Thomas Lubanga, and he's being prosecuted solely on this charge. Fully support that criminal prosecution. But one of the problems with the international narrative is A, it focuses all of our resources on punishing a handful of adult recruiters. And what that does is it locates blame only on one person, the adult recruiter. And what that means is that all the other sources that contribute to child soldiering, and there are many, local communities who encourage their children to fight, international arms trade that funds rebel groups that have child soldiers in them, Western consumers that buy products that fuel conflict in many parts of the world, state responsibility, leaders who say nothing. And our own stances on child soldiering are very mixed. Let me tell you, the face of rebel movements in the Arab world were very young. Opponents to Muammar Gaddafi faced the prospect that many children, youth, adolescents came forward to volunteer to fight. NATO remained quite silent about that, even though youth were involved in the rebel movements in Libya, under 18s, moreover. You can't just focus on the one adult recruiter. Justice means a lot more than that. But by focusing on the one adult recruiter, which is what international criminal law does, you don't have these broader conversations that can uproot the broad variety of systemic causes of child soldiering. International law has flattened the differences between the child abducted into fighting forces and the child who comes forth to volunteer. Volunteerism is no defense to the recruitment of a minor under the age of 18 in armed groups, and increasingly that view is applying to state militaries and armed forces. That may be very well intentioned, but the reality at the end of the day is that enlisting a volunteer and kidnapping and torturing someone and forcing them to fight is not the same thing. And treating abductees like you treat a volunteer recruit does some injustice to the child who is abducted. Treating all child soldiers equally as faultless passive victims does injustice to the child soldiers who suffer the most. It does a terrible injustice to girl soldiers. The proportion of girl soldiers implicated in serial acts of atrocity is smaller than that of boy soldiers. The vast majority of girl soldiers are sex slaves, forced wives. Many girl soldiers give birth to children while associated with armed forces and armed groups. That, in fact, is the third way that children end up in fighting forces: abduction, coming forth to volunteer, and thirdly, birth. The focus on the equation of volunteerism with abduction also does a disservice, I think, to children born into fighting forces, and it truly does a disservice when all child soldiers are treated as moral equals. It glosses over the reality that all child soldiers are not moral equals. The child soldier who resists is different than the child soldier who commits more acts of atrocity. The girl soldier is in a fundamentally different position. But when all child soldiers return to their home communities and are exonerated from the need to have a conversation about what happened while they were fighting, none of these stories are told. There is no room for the resistor to be heard, and there's no room for the child soldier who suffered the most to be heard. There is no conversation, in fact. Life is to replay as it once was, notwithstanding the ruptures that occurred. Nor is there an opportunity for the child soldier to come up and to blame the community for what happened to him or her. There is no conversation. There's no room for the child soldier to say, "You encouraged me to fight and told me I was fighting for a good cause, and it turned out to be a criminal syndicate, murdering and raping." There's no room for those conversations. There's no room for justice for the child soldier from the community, just as there's no room for the community to have justice for the violence that it may have suffered. International law further builds on this fiction by inflexibly insisting on chronology, a number, as the passage point from childhood to adulthood. There are no interstitial categories. There's no plasticity. You're a child, you're 18, you're an adult. Goes from one to the other. That negates the reality that in most parts of the world, coming of age is part of a sequence. It's part of a continuum. In war-torn societies, coming of age may revolve as much on the station you occupy in life as necessarily the age that you are chronologically. Coming of age involves initiation. It involves experience. It involves what you did. Many child soldiers who come home after conflict are children, age-wise. They may be parents. They're heads of households. To infantilize them upon return is incongruous with their own experiences and their own expectations. Having a binary of under 18 innocent, over 18 guilty means the law comes down extremely harsh on the 19-year-old, the 18-year-old, and the 20-year-old. On the ground, realistically, are the choices that a 19-year-old faces that structurally different than the choices of a 17-year-old? Is the mental ability, independence, maturity of a 20-year-old that immensely different than that of a 16-year-old? I don't know. There may be differences. But are they so firm, are they opposite sides of a chasm, such that the exoneration of responsibility of anyone under 18 is negated entirely for anyone over the age of 18? But yet international law comes down very harshly on fighters over the age of 18. One of the first cases at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia involved a man called Erdemovic. He pled a defense of duress. He was 18 when he joined fighting forces in the former Yugoslavia and was in his early 20s when he was told he was in a non-combat unit. He shows up on a field. His commander forces him to kill 80 people standing in a row on a farm. He says no. The commander says, "Do it or you will die." He has a young child and a wife. He does it. He has a mental breakdown. He turns himself into the International Criminal Tribunal, pleads to everything he did wrong. He's a broken man. The tribunal prosecutes him, convicts him. He argues a duress defense. I had to do it. Moreover, on top of being in his early 20s, he also was not a particularly well-educated or a particularly bright individual. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia says that duress can never be a defense to systematic violations of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law and crimes against humanity. But yet the 17-year-old returning would have been absolved of any responsibility, and there would have been no conversation. When the law draws bright lines, it comes down very lightly on one end and unduly harshly on the other end. Another important point that arises in communities that receive child soldiers under international law is the incapacity of children during wartime often translates very poorly into children and youth being treated seriously as rights holders, as vibrant members of civic society after conflict. I think it's very important to recognize that rights can be taken seriously only when they're paired with responsibilities. I think it's important for those who work hard to embed a paradigm of human rights to recognize that being a rights holder and a full member of society also entails having some obligation for breaching the rights of others. What are some of the externalities, the disconnects that arise between law and policy? One of the major shortcomings is there is no transitional justice for child soldiers who return. There is no process by which formally communities can discuss, dialogue, or learn from the former child soldier with regards to the violence that occurred. And as I mentioned before, these conversations go from the public to the private. And as a result, that's one major reason why one of the most at-risk groups for re-recruitment into fighting forces, for social marginalization, for falling into criminal behavior in post-conflict situations are children who are associated with fighting forces, who come back to communities who know that, who've committed acts of atrocity, and then nothing is done. A second major shortcoming that arises is this, and this is one that's particularly disturbing to me. The content of international law and policy and international human rights lawyers and publics that support this image of the child soldier largely do so in the context of, as I've talked about in some informal contexts here earlier, African children involved in violence against Africans. In those situations, the children are viewed as innocent. Nepalese children involved in violence against Nepalese children. But when child soldiers, when militarized youth, when terrorists and suicide bombers under the age of 18 target Western populations, they are no longer deluded children or purposeless, aimless youth. They're purposeful evildoers. Omar Khadr, the first case that went to the US military commissions, involved a 15-year-old recruit in the Taliban. There was no conversation about faultless passive victimhood for him. One of the first piracy convictions in the United States involved a Somali teenager who boarded a ship, the Maersk Alabama, was involved in the murder of its captain, prosecuted in New York, sentenced to the maximum of the sentencing range. When international law works asymmetrically, when the faultless passive victimhood narrative applies to the child soldier in the periphery, who hurts people in the periphery, but does not apply to the child in the periphery who attacks the center and hurts the center, then law loses its legitimacy. It also suggests to me that the architects of faultless passive victimhood only believe it when it's convenient to believe it because it affects others and not themselves. Look at immigration and refugee law. A large number of countries in the West are called upon to receive former child soldiers who request asylum in their jurisdiction. Under Article 1F of the Convention for the Rights of Refugees from 1951, a person against whom there's grounds to believe has committed a crime against humanity or a war crime can be deemed inadmissible for refugee or asylum status. Former child soldiers have applied for refugee status and have been deemed inadmissible because of evidence that they were involved in crimes against humanity and war crimes. But if they didn't have the capacity to do so, if they were faultless passive victims, then it makes no sense to exclude them on this basis because they wouldn't have the mental element or the physical capacity to actually commit the crime. But Canada, the United States, many European countries have excluded child soldiers precisely on that ground. Perhaps we don't believe the image when it applies to us, or when we may have to internalize the risk that the image is wrong. So I would argue a more honest portrayal of child soldiers in overall discourse would reduce these asymmetries, would have a more forthright and constructive conversation, where law is not applied in an asymmetrical or unfair or uneven way. I also think at the end of the day that one of the major successes of faultless passive victimhood imagery is that it has succeeded in creating an international consensus that children should not be criminally prosecuted for acts of atrocity or crimes against humanity. I'm a deep skeptic, as I said right at the beginning of my remarks, of the place of courtrooms and jailhouses to deal with people who are involved in mass violence, in crimes against humanity and genocide. I believe those institutions are appropriate for the highest level leaders, but I don't believe they're appropriate for anything that falls below that. I certainly don't believe they're appropriate for child soldiers. Hence, in that regard, I support indirectly the faultless passive victim image in that it has taken somewhat off the table the demon and bandit conceptualization, the child should be prosecuted criminally and locked away in jail for a long period of time. The problem with the faultless passive victim image, though, is that it is so unyielding, it's so omnipresent, that it has not only taken criminal trials off the table, it's taken all forms of accountability off the table. It's removed child soldiers from truth and reconciliation commissions. Child soldiers in a myriad of countries can only appear before truth and reconciliation commissions as victims and as witnesses. There can be no conversation of their involvement as perpetrators. I'm a huge proponent of restorative forms of justice, traditional purification ceremonies, cleansing rituals, a variety of customary practices that communities worldwide put in place to welcome back those who may have breached the social order. Restorative justice isn't contingent on measuring the guilt or innocence of the person who broke the social order. It's contingent on welcoming that person back and facilitating the making of amends such that the injured and the injurer can live together harmoniously. International criminal law is focused entirely on simplistic binaries: victim, victimizer, innocent, guilty, captive, captor. But the world of atrocity doesn't work like that. Victimizers may very well be victims. Victims may victimize. Captors may hold people captive, and the captives may themselves become captors. The injured can also injure others. The human condition in times of atrocity is painfully ambiguous and woefully messy. Law's simplistic binaries don't capture that. But restorative justice measures do. And I think the fear of international lawyers and human rights activists of the fragility of the child soldier have taken off the table a whole bunch of restorative and transitional and rehabilitative justice mechanisms that I believe would promote not only the best interests of former child soldiers, but would promote the best interests of communities as a whole, including children. When we talk about the best interests of children in conflict zones, it's often just associated with the best interests of the child soldier. Yet a large segment of the victims of acts of child soldiers, at least those, a small subset who commit such acts, are other children. Most girl soldiers are raped by boy soldiers, not by adult commanders. But there can be no conversation about redress for that or responsibility for that, because all child soldiers are viewed as morally indistinguishable innocents. And to my mind, that is just too simplistic a calculation. At the end of the day, I would encourage a number of reforms to international law and policy. And it starts with reimagining the child soldier. It starts with dressing down and taking off the stage, the imagery of faultless passive victimhood, and replacing it with something less tendentious, something less judgmental, something less didactic, something more nuanced, reflective of reality, careful. And that is the construction that, I don't care what you call it, I would call it a circumscribed action model. A model that is in line with lots of evidence that to date has received inadequate attention. I'm going to take 2 more minutes and then end, because I'm eager for any comments or questions. When I've presented this idea, and the book will come out in a couple of months, I've received 2 major objections, and maybe you'll all impress me and come up with 77 more that I can quickly add to my list. 2 major objections I would distill in 2 groups. One is pragmatics, and the second is fear. Let me start with fear. I hear sometimes from some observers that by taking down the imagery, by removing and dismantling the legal fiction, I may be opening the door to something much worse. I may be opening the door to the floodgates of the demon and bandit imagery. I may be opening the door to the exact methods of justice that I resist: punitive criminal trials, indiscriminate sanctions, revenge on former child soldiers. In response to that, I would argue that the international legal imagination can do much better at coming up with other methods of curbing punitive policies than the faultless passive victim image, especially given the inadequacies of the faultless passive victim image on the ground, and the reality that in many communities that receive repatriated child soldiers, acts of marginalization and vengeance against former child soldiers suspected of committing acts of atrocity, just like acts of marginalization of girl soldiers, continue to persist. We can do better. I think an inadequate status quo shouldn't be retained out of fear that something worse might happen. Because frankly, I think we can do a lot better in coming up with a much more sophisticated response. The second critique is one of pragmatics. Surely, Mark, you can't be serious that in resource-strapped post-conflict societies, investment is going to occur in talking about the acts of violence perpetrated by a minority of child soldiers. Surely there are bigger fish to fry, so to speak. And my response to that would be that solidly embedding youth in society, cultivating and emboldening child's rights, taking juveniles seriously, is an extremely important policy goal. It lays the ground for a solid future, and just like youth can become mobilized into violence, properly anchored youth can mobilize against violence and can resist abuses of authority by those older than them. Moreover, on a purely numbers note, the average cost of reintegrating a former fighter in, for example, Mozambique, which is another jurisdiction where there has been child soldiers, the average cost of reintegrating a former fighter through traditional means of ceremonial rituals has been estimated at approximately $800. The average conviction at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda has been $20 million. The costs of doing what I'm proposing are really not that high. And if the international community is so willing to invest so much in the criminal prosecution of a handful of adults, it can surely do better, pragmatically speaking, and bang for the buck in terms of better anchoring youth in the future. So at the end of the day, I urge you to think twice about something you may take for granted. I urge you to revisit some assumptions that you may have. And I think that that is the best way for us collectively to move forward and ensure that child soldiering can be accurately understood
instead of assumed. Because without understanding the problem, any preventative solution is going to be pyrrhic, and any remedial policy is only going to be half-hearted at best. What we may think is the soothing response may simply be poor policy. Thanks.